I am Joshua, 31 years old, and my entire family flew across 15 states for my brother's gender reveal. But a month later, not a single one of them showed up to my wedding. Thank you for being here. Grab a warm glass of water, sit down, and listen to my whole story. I stood in the middle of my quiet apartment, staring down at my phone resting on the kitchen counter. It was vibrating so hard and so continuously that it was slowly inching its way toward the edge of the granite. The screen was a blinding wall of notifications. Missed calls, text messages, urgent voicemails. I watched the names flash across the glass. Patricia, Richard, Carter, Evelyn, Aunt Linda. 34 days. That was exactly how long it had been since I stood at an altar in Virginia, looking out at 24 empty white folding chairs. For 34 days, my family had treated me like a ghost. They had ignored my calls, glossed over my wedding in our group chats, and carried on with their picture-perfect, wealthy lives as if my existence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Now, suddenly, I was the most important person in their world. I picked up the phone. 215 notifications in the span of 2 hours. My mother, Patricia, had left 4 voicemails, her tone shifting from casual sweetness to frantic desperation. My brother, Carter, the golden child who usually couldn't be bothered to remember my birthday, had sent 12 text messages begging me to call him back immediately. Even my sister-in-law, Evelyn, who had openly mocked my life choices just a few months prior, was suddenly blowing up my inbox with apologies and dinner invitations. They were terrified, and they had every right to be. They didn't know that I was staring at the screen with absolute coldness. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. The old Joshua, the son who would have scrambled to answer the phone, desperate for a crumb of their attention and approval, was gone. He died on a Saturday afternoon in front of an empty row of chairs. What caused this sudden, desperate panic? It wasn't guilt. It wasn't a sudden realization that they loved me. It was a brutal, terrifying collision with reality. They had just discovered who my wife really was. The woman they had sneered at, the woman they had deemed unimportant, held the absolute power to save them from total financial ruin or let them drown. And right now, their entire empire was crumbling to the ground. But to understand how we got to this point of absolute destruction, and why I didn't feel a single shred of pity as I watched my phone light up with their panic, you have to understand the 24 empty chairs. You have to understand the house in Falls Church, and the lifetime of being the invisible son. Because the distance they claimed kept them from my wedding was never about geography. It was always about value. To understand my family, you just had to look at our dining room table. We lived in a sprawling, 5-bedroom colonial in Falls Church, Virginia. My mother, Patricia, treated that house less like a home and more like a showroom. She ran a chain of 5 high-end boutique clothing stores called Maison Patricia, and her entire identity was wrapped up in the illusion of flawless, generational wealth. Everything had to look expensive. Everything had to be perfect. My father, Richard, ran a management consulting firm. He was a quiet, passive man who found it much easier to simply nod and agree with my mother rather than face her wrath. He paid the bills, funded the lifestyle, and stayed out of the line of fire. And then there was Carter, my younger brother by 4 years. Carter was the golden child. He was the star quarterback in high school, the homecoming king, the boy who could do no wrong. He grew up into a lifestyle influencer, a man whose entire career was built on posting curated photos of his supposed success. He married Evelyn, a ruthless real estate developer who drove a pristine white Porsche and spoke about other people as if they were dirt on her shoes. They were my mother's pride and joy. Every Sunday we had family dinner. The seating arrangement was an unspoken law. My mother sat at the head of the long, mahogany table. My father sat to her right. Carter and Evelyn sat across from each other in the center, dominating the conversation with talk of investments, luxury vacations, and Evelyn's latest aggressive business deals. I sat at the very end, the seat right next to the swinging door that led to the kitchen. Every time our housekeeper or my mother got up to fetch more wine, the heavy wooden door would swing back and smack the back of my chair. I would have to scoot forward, apologizing for being in the way. I was a freelance graphic designer. I drove a 6-year-old Honda. I lived in a modest apartment. To my mother, my career was just Joshua's little computer hobby. I didn't bring prestige to the Townsend name. Therefore, I was seated by the door. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn a seat closer to the center of the table. I thought if I just worked harder, if I was just quieter, if I never caused any trouble, my parents would eventually look at me the way they looked at Carter. I craved their validation. I wanted my mother to brag about me to her country club friends. I wanted my father to ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. But the truth was, no matter what I did, the swinging door always hit my chair. They had cast me in the role of the disappointing, unremarkable supporting character in the grand play of their lives. And nowhere was this more painfully obvious than the day I finally thought I had done something worthy of their attention. I was 14 years old when I learned exactly where I stood. I had spent 4 months working on an oil painting of the Shenandoah Valley for the Virginia statewide Young Artist Competition. There were over 2,000 entries that year. I poured my soul into that canvas. I stayed after school every single day in the art room, my hands stained with paint, trying to capture the exact way the sunlight hit the mountains. When the letter arrived in the mail saying I had won first place, my hands shook. I ran into the kitchen and handed it to my mother. She glanced at it, offered a tight, polite smile and said, "That's nice, Joshua. Make sure you wash your hands before dinner." But she promised she would be there at the award ceremony. She promised she would sit in the front row. The ceremony was held in a large auditorium in Richmond. When they called my name, the spotlight hit the stage. I walked up to the podium, holding my brass plaque, my heart swelling with a pride I had never felt before. I looked out into the audience, searching for my mother's face. The third row where she said she would be was empty. My art teacher, Mrs. Calloway, was the only one clapping for me. I could see tears in her eyes, but my family wasn't there. Mrs. Calloway had to drive me home that night in her station wagon. I walked through the front door of my house, clutching my heavy brass plaque, and found my mother sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by expensive sports equipment. She looked up at me, barely registering the plaque in my hands. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, syrupy tone she used to dismiss people. "But Carter's regional championship is in 2 weeks and he needed new custom cleats and gear. You understand, right? Your little painting will still be there tomorrow." My little painting. Not my achievement. Not my hard work. My little painting. I walked up to my room and closed the door. I didn't cry. I just felt a heavy, cold stone settle in the pit of my stomach. The next day, I took the painting out of the trunk of Mrs. Calloway's car. I didn't hang it on my wall. I didn't show it to my father. I wrapped it in a trash bag and shoved it into the darkest corner of the garage, behind a stack of Carter's old athletic trophies. I stopped painting after that. I convinced myself that art was a waste of time, just like my mother said. I learned to keep my head down, to expect nothing, and to accept my place by the kitchen door. I thought I had buried the hurt. I thought I had moved on. But the truth is, you never really stop wanting your parents to show up for you. It took another 17 years for me to finally understand that they never would. I met Chloe on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in a small, independent coffee shop in Georgetown. I was sitting at a corner table, staring at my laptop screen, trying to design a logo for a local bakery. I was stressed, overworked, and worried about my monthly rent. She walked in shaking the rain out of her hair. She was wearing faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a slightly oversized red flannel shirt. She ordered a black coffee, glanced around the crowded room, and asked if she could share my table. I nodded, barely looking up from my screen. For the first 20 minutes, we sat in silence. Then, she leaned over and pointed at my laptop. "The kerning on that font is driving me crazy," she said casually. I blinked, surprised. I looked at the letters. She was right. I adjusted the spacing, and the logo instantly looked better. "Thanks," I said. "I'm Joshua, freelance designer." "Chloe," She smiled, extending her hand. I work in finance. Mostly boring spreadsheets and long meetings. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about art, about the city, about our favorite terrible movies. There was an ease to her that I had never encountered before. She didn't ask me how much money I made. She didn't ask what kind of car I drove. She just asked what made me happy. In my family, every conversation was a transaction, a subtle sizing up of your net worth. With Chloe, it was just human connection. We started dating. We ate cheap takeout on my tiny apartment balcony. We took long walks around the monuments at night. She always drove an old, dented Subaru. She never wore designer clothes or expensive jewelry. When my mother asked about her during one of our forced Sunday dinners, I kept it brief. She works in an office downtown, I said, ignoring Evelyn's dramatic eye roll across the table. Well, as long as she can pay her own rent, my mother sniffed, slicing her steak. We certainly don't need any gold diggers attaching themselves to this family. I almost laughed out loud at the irony. My family's entire existence was built on digging for gold. But I kept my mouth shut. I loved Chloe. I loved the simple, quiet life we were building together. I didn't want the toxicity of the Townsend family anywhere near her. I wanted to protect her from their judgment and their endless obsession with status. I thought I knew exactly who she was. A hard-working, middle-class woman who understood the value of $1. Couldn't have been more wrong. The truth about Chloe was hiding in plain sight, and when it finally came to light, it felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I found out on a Thursday. I was at my friend Elijah's office. Elijah was a corporate lawyer in D.C., the kind of guy who read financial briefs for fun over his lunch break. He was a loyal friend, one of the few people who knew exactly how awful my family could be. We were eating sandwiches at his desk when he suddenly stopped chewing, staring intently at his computer monitor. He slowly turned the screen toward me. "Joshua," he said, his voice unusually serious. "How long have you been dating Chloe?" 8 months, I said, confused. "Why?" Elijah tapped the screen. It was an article from Forbes magazine. The headline read, "The Quiet Powerhouse: How Ashford Capital's 30-year-old CEO is Reshaping Private Equity." Beneath the headline was a high-resolution professional photograph. It was Chloe. She wasn't wearing a flannel shirt. She was wearing a tailored navy suit. Her hair was perfectly styled. The caption named her as Chloe Ashford, founder and CEO of a private equity fund managing $2.3 billion in assets. Billion. With AB. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. My brain refused to process the information. The woman who split a $12 pizza with me on Friday nights was running a multi-billion-dollar empire. I confronted her that evening. When she walked into my apartment, I had the article pulled up on my laptop. She saw it, froze, and let out a long, heavy sigh. She didn't try to lie. She sat down on my worn-out couch and looked me straight in the eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," she said softly, "but I needed to know who you were." She explained that she had inherited a modest sum from her grandfather and turned it into an empire through sheer brilliance and ruthless work ethic. But as her wealth grew, the people around her changed. "I watched money turn people into strangers," she told me, her voice tight with emotion. "Men dated me for my connections. Friends kept pitching me business ideas. I swore I'd never let that happen to me again. I wanted to know if I met someone, would they stay if they thought I had nothing?" I sat there, absorbing her words. I thought about my mother, who measured a person's worth by the brand of their shoes. I thought about Carter and Evelyn, who would likely trample over their own grandmother for a lucrative real estate deal. "I understand," I told her, and I meant it. I made a decision right then and there. We were going to keep her identity a secret from my family. I knew exactly what would happen if Patricia and Evelyn found out that my girlfriend was a billionaire CEO. They would suddenly love me. They would suddenly invite me to the center of the table. They would swarm Chloe like sharks smelling blood in the water. I wanted my family to love me, not for my proximity to wealth. It was a foolish, naive hope, but I clung to it. Elijah warned me, When they find out, and they will, he said, adjusting his glasses. They are going to show you exactly who they are. I didn't listen. I was about to learn the hard way. Chloe proposed to me on a quiet Sunday morning while we were making pancakes in my tiny kitchen. There was no grand gesture, no photographer hiding in the bushes, no expensive restaurant. She just handed me a coffee mug, slipped a heavy platinum band onto the counter, and asked if I wanted to make breakfast with her for the rest of our lives. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. That evening, I took a picture of our hands together, the ring gleaming in the kitchen light. I opened the Townsend family group chat. My heart was actually thumping in my chest. Even after everything, that little 14-year-old boy inside me still wanted his family to be happy for him. I typed out the message. She asked. I said yes. We're getting married. I hit send and watched the screen, waiting for the flurry of congratulations. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. That's nice, Joshua, she wrote. That was it. 3 words. But before I could even process the sting of that hollow response, another message popped up instantly from her. Patricia, Evelyn, Carter, have we finalized the balloon arch colors for the gender reveal party next month? I'm thinking we need more gold to match the Porsche. Evelyn, yes, gold and white. It's going to be so elegant. The caterer just confirmed the lobster rolls. Carter, can't wait. This is going to be epic. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched them plan a party for an unborn child, completely and utterly ignoring the fact that their oldest son had just announced his engagement. They sent 36 messages back and forth about napkin rings, champagne fountains, and hotel bookings in Florida. Not a single one of them asked about Chloe. Not a single one asked when the wedding would be. It was as if I had walked into a room and shouted my good news, and they had all just turned their backs and continued discussing the weather. I showed the chat to Chloe. She read it quietly, her jaw tightening. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell me they didn't mean it. She just pulled me into a hug and said, "We don't need their permission to be happy, Joshua." But the rejection settled deep in my bones. When Carter had gotten engaged to Evelyn, my mother threw a lavish engagement party at the country club with 80 guests. She hired a professional photographer. She posted about it for weeks. For me, I got a "that's nice" and a pivot to balloon colors. It was the first undeniable proof of the war that was coming. I was drawing a line in the sand by marrying someone they deemed ordinary, and they were responding by freezing me out entirely. The storm was gathering, and the first major strike was going to happen 15 states away, at a party paid for with dirty money and built on an ocean of lies. The gender reveal party was held a month later at a luxury beachfront resort in Naples, Florida. My mother had spared absolutely no expense. She flew out 23 members of our extended family. Aunt Linda from Connecticut, Uncle Jim from Ohio, cousins I hadn't seen in a decade. They all got fully paid flights and hotel rooms. The total cost was easily north of $40,000. Chloe and I flew down, but we paid for our own economy tickets and booked a cheap motel 2 miles down the road from the resort. When we arrived at the party, it was a circus of excess. There was a live jazz band, a raw seafood bar, and a massive ice sculpture. Evelyn was holding court by the pool, heavily pregnant, complaining loudly about how difficult it was to find good valet parking for her new white Porsche Cayenne. We were seated at a table on the far edge of the patio, right next to the kitchen doors where the waitstaff rushed in and out. The familiar spot. During dinner, Carter and Evelyn finally graced our table with their presence. Carter slapped me on the back, smelling strongly of expensive scotch. "Hey bro, glad you could make it to the main event." Evelyn looked Chloe up and down, her eyes lingering on Chloe's simple, off-the-rack sundress. Evelyn smirked, a cruel, practiced expression. "So, Chloe," she said, her voice carrying over the music, "still doing that little office job? Data entry or whatever it is?" I felt my blood boil. "She works in finance, Evelyn." Evelyn laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "Right? Like a day trader thing. How cute." Carter's firm is about to close a massive waterfront development deal in Virginia Beach. Real money, you know? Not just pushing papers around. Chloe didn't flinch. She took a sip of her water, her expression completely serene. That sounds very ambitious, Evelyn. I hope the financing is solid. Real estate development can be quite risky if your collateral isn't properly valued. Evelyn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic crossing her eyes before she masked it with arrogance. We don't worry about risk. We play in the big leagues. She turned away, dismissing us entirely. Later that evening, I watched my family gather on the beach as a chartered helicopter flew overhead, dropping thousands of gold and white confetti pieces into the ocean to announce they were having a boy. My mother was weeping tears of joy. Aunt Linda was cheering. It was a picture-perfect family moment. I stood in the back, holding Chloe's hand, feeling completely alienated. I looked at these people, my blood, and realized I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. They had spent $40,000 to celebrate themselves, while actively tearing down the woman I loved. I didn't know it then, but Evelyn's boast about her big league real estate deal was a massive, fragile house of cards. And the woman she had just mocked as a lowly paper pusher was the exact person who held the power to knock the entire thing down. We planned our wedding for 6 weeks after the Florida extravaganza. It wasn't a $40,000 spectacle. It was a simple, elegant afternoon ceremony at Willowbrook Vineyard, a beautiful property in the Virginia foothills. It was exactly a 2-hour drive from my parents' house in Falls Church. I sent out 23 invitations to the exact same family members who had just flown across the country for Carter. I gave them plenty of notice. I even offered to help coordinate carpools for some of the older relatives. Then the RSVPs started coming back. Decline, decline, decline. Aunt Linda wrote, "We just flew to Florida last month. Sweetie, we're completely travel exhausted. Connecticut to Florida was a 3-hour flight. Connecticut to Virginia was a 4-hour drive. But apparently, exhaustion only applied to my events." Evelyn texted, "I'm pregnant, Joshua. I can't be bouncing around in a car for 2 hours. Send pics though." She was 5 months pregnant. The exact same 5 months pregnant she was when she danced in heels until midnight in Florida. My father sent a brief email. "I'll try, Joshua. You know how your mother gets with her schedule." He didn't try. 10 days before the wedding, my mother called. Elijah, my lawyer friend, had advised me to start recording my calls with her. "Virginia is a one-party consent state," he had said. "Protect yourself." I hit the record button. "Joshua, honey," my mother said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It's just a small ceremony anyway, right? It's not like Carter's reveal. That was a real family event. Don't take it personally that we can't make the drive. We're just so busy with the boutiques." She didn't even say sorry. She called my wedding not a real event. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall. 23 invitations. 23 declines. The day of the wedding was beautiful. The sun was shining, and the wisteria was in full bloom over the arbor. Chloe looked breathtaking in her white dress. But when I stood at the altar and looked out at the seating, the reality hit me like a physical blow. On Chloe's side, there were 30 guests. Her mother, Margaret, a retired law professor who treated me with more respect in 1 year than my mother had in my entire life, sat in the front row. Her friends and colleagues were there, smiling warmly. On my side, there was Elijah, Mrs. Calloway from high school, and a few college buddies. Behind them were 24 perfectly aligned, empty white wooden chairs. The wedding planner had offered to remove them, to close the gap so it didn't look so stark. "No," I told her. "Leave them. I want to see it. I wanted to burn that image into my memory. I wanted to remember exactly what my family's love looked like. Nothing. Blank space." Chloe stood in front of me, took both my hands in hers, and looked directly into my eyes. She didn't look at the empty chairs. "Their absence is not your failure, Joshua," she whispered, her voice strong and unwavering. "It's their loss. And one day, they will know exactly what they missed." We said our vows. We kissed. We drank champagne and danced under the string lights. It was the happiest day of my life, but beneath the joy was a cold, hard resolve that had finally solidified in my chest. The day after my wedding, the grief finally burned away, leaving behind something much more dangerous. Absolute clarity. I wasn't sad anymore. I was done being the victim. I was done waiting for the swinging door to hit my chair. I was sitting in Elijah's office, going over some contract work for my design business, when he slid a printed screenshot across the desk. "I wasn't sure if I should show you this," he said quietly. "My sister is in a book club with your Aunt Linda's daughter. This got forwarded around by accident." I picked up the paper. It was a screenshot of a text message sent from my mother to a massive group chat containing every single member of the Townsend extended family. It was dated a week before my wedding invitations even went out in the mail. "Patricia, just a heads up everyone. Joshua is doing some little ceremony thing next month out in the middle of nowhere. Don't worry about trying to make it. It's not a real event and Carter and Evelyn need us focused on the baby preparations anyway. Don't waste your Saturday on Joshua's little ceremony. He'll be fine. He always is." I read the words 3 times. My hands didn't shake. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt a bizarre, icy calm wash over my entire body. It wasn't that they were just lazy. It wasn't that 2 hours was too far to drive. My mother had actively orchestrated a boycott of my wedding. She had explicitly instructed our entire family that my life milestone was worthless, a waste of a Saturday, simply because it didn't revolve around her or her golden child. And 23 adults had blindly obeyed her. "Document everything for clarity," Elijah said, repeating the advice he had given me months ago. "Not for revenge, for protection." I nodded. I went home, opened my laptop, and created a new folder on my Google Drive. I named it Receipts. I started dropping files into it. The screenshot Elijah gave me. The recording of my mother calling my wedding not a real event. The snarky text messages from Evelyn about being too pregnant to drive. The decline RSVP cards citing travel exhaustion right after they flew to Florida. I made a spreadsheet tracking exactly how much money they spent on Carter versus the $0 and 0 minutes they spent on me. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with this folder yet, but I knew that the truth was a weapon, and for the first time in my life I was holding the handle instead of standing in front of the blade. While I was building my arsenal in silence, the universe was already setting up the board for my family's destruction. The luxury lifestyle they worshipped was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was rapidly coming in. The dominoes were lined up, and the first one was about to fall right onto Evelyn's expensive white Porsche. The collapse began slowly, a series of quiet financial tremors that soon turned into a catastrophic earthquake. Evelyn's highly boasted real estate project, the Keller Residences in Virginia Beach, hit a massive brick wall. She and Carter had leveraged everything they owned, including their house and the cars, to secure the initial construction loans. But the general contractor walked off the job after Evelyn missed 3 consecutive progress payments. Then, the bank sent a formal notice. Produce $1.8 million in liquidity within 60 days, or face immediate foreclosure on the entire development. Suddenly, the arrogant woman who bragged about playing in the big leagues was drowning. She and Carter started frantically pitching every private equity firm on the East Coast, begging for a bailout. They submitted their glossy brochures and aggressive projections, but firm after firm rejected them. The numbers didn't add up. There were gaping holes in their accounting, missing insurance bonds, and highly questionable operating expenses. Meanwhile, my mother's precious empire was also taking on water. 2 of her 5 Maison Patricia boutique locations received lease renewal notices with a devastating 40% rent increase. Her sales had been steadily declining for years due to her refusal to adapt to online shopping. She needed a massive cash infusion, at least $200,000, just to keep the doors open and pay her backlogged vendors. She went to my father to ask for the money, but Richard had his own problems. His consulting firm had just lost its biggest client, a woman named Helen Calder, who sat on several powerful corporate boards. Richard's income was slashed in half. Panic set in at the house in Falls Church. The Sunday dinners turned into screaming matches. Evelyn blamed Carter for not networking harder. Patricia blamed Richard for being useless. The facade of the perfect, wealthy Townsend family was cracking wide open, exposing the desperate, debt-ridden reality beneath. Evelyn had one last shot. There was one major private equity fund that hadn't explicitly rejected her proposal yet. It was a massive firm known for occasionally rescuing distressed assets if the terms were highly favorable. It was her final lifeline to save the project, the Porsche, and her entire identity. She spent 3 sleepless nights preparing the pitch deck for this final firm. She told Carter, "If we don't land this meeting, we lose the house. We lose everything." The name of the firm was Ashford Capital Partners. They had absolutely no idea that the executioner they were begging for a pardon was the same woman they had banished to the corner table by the kitchen door. The truth didn't just knock on their door. It kicked it off the hinges. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Greg Mitchell, Evelyn's junior business partner, was doing the standard due diligence before formally submitting the final pitch deck to Ashford Capital. He was sitting in their rented office space, digging through the firm's website to find an angle, trying to figure out who the decision-makers were. He Googled the CEO. The search results instantly pulled up the Forbes magazine feature. Greg stared at his computer screen. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. He recognized the face. He had seen that exact woman standing quietly in the background at the absurdly expensive gender reveal party in Florida. He had heard Evelyn mock her. He knew she was married to Carter's brother. Greg slowly turned his laptop around to face Evelyn. "Evelyn," he said, his voice trembling, "isn't this Joshua's wife? The one you said was a day trader." Evelyn looked at the screen. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She read the headline, "Chloe Ashford, CEO, $2.3 billion in assets." In a matter of seconds, the horrifying reality crashed down on her. The financial savior she desperately needed, the only person who could stop the bank from taking her home and her business, was the woman she had publicly humiliated. The woman whose wedding she had boycotted. Evelyn lunged for her phone and called Carter. Carter started hyperventilating and immediately called Patricia. Patricia dropped a rack of silk blouses in her failing boutique and called Richard. Within an hour, the entire Townsend family knew. The despised, invisible oldest son hadn't just married well. He had married the kingmaker. And that is exactly when my phone started to vibrate on my kitchen counter. That is when the 215 missed calls, texts, and voicemails began flooding in. The 34 days of dead silence were instantly broken by a wave of absolute, groveling panic. "Joshua, baby, please call your mother back. I miss you so much. Bro, we need to talk. Let's get a beer. Miss you, man. Joshua, it's Evelyn. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Let's do dinner. My treat." I stood in my apartment, looking at the glowing screen, the receipts folder open on my laptop behind it. They thought they could just flip a switch. They thought they could erase a lifetime of neglect, the cruel text messages, and the 24 empty chairs with a few desperate voicemails. They thought they could manipulate me one last time to get to my wife's money. They were about to find out that the man they were trying to play no longer existed. The storm had fully arrived, and I was holding the lightning. I didn't answer a single one of their 215 frantic calls. I let the phone ring until the battery drained and the screen finally went black. The silence in my apartment was beautiful. It was the sound of a completely shifted power dynamic. But I knew my mother, Patricia. I knew she wasn't a woman who gave up when money was on the line. She was a woman who doubled down. 2 days later, on a Thursday evening, someone knocked on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting Elijah, and Chloe was still at the office. I looked through the peephole. It was my mother. She was standing in the hallway of my modest Arlington apartment building, holding a massive, ridiculously expensive gourmet gift basket wrapped in cellophane and a gold ribbon. She was wearing a tailored Chanel jacket, her hair perfectly blown out, looking like she was ready for a photo shoot rather than a casual visit to the son she had ignored for 34 days. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. I didn't step back to let her in. I just stood in the frame. "Joshua, baby," she gasped, her voice pitching up an octave into that sickly sweet tone she reserved for her wealthy clients. She shoved the heavy basket toward my chest. "I brought you some things from that Italian market you used to like. Oh, I've missed you so much. We all have." She tried to push past me, her eyes darting quickly around my small living room. She was looking for Chloe. She was looking for the billionaire. I stood my ground, blocking the entrance. I didn't take the basket. I just looked at her. Her smile was incredibly tight, the muscles in her jaw working hard to maintain the illusion of a happy, loving mother. "What are you doing here, Mom?" I asked. My voice wasn't angry. It was just flat. "What kind of question is that?" She forced a laugh, shifting her weight. "I came to see my eldest son. It's been too long. Evelyn and Carter are so eager to get together for a family dinner. We thought maybe this weekend, you and Chloe could come out to the house. Richard is firing up the grill." I leaned against the doorframe. I let the silence stretch out between us for 10 long seconds. I watched the fake smile slowly begin to crack, revealing the sheer, desperate panic underneath. "You didn't come here because you miss me," I said, looking her dead in the eyes. "You came because you Googled my wife." Patricia flinched as if I had slapped her across the face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The Chanel jacket suddenly looked ridiculous in the harsh fluorescent lighting of my hallway. The basket trembled in her hands. "That is an awful thing to say to your mother," she finally managed, her voice dropping the sweet act and taking on its familiar, sharp edge. "It's the truth," I replied. "You couldn't drive 2 hours for my wedding. But you drove an hour in rush hour traffic today because you found out Chloe runs Ashford Capital. The bank is calling Evelyn's loans. Isn't it? The boutiques are failing." Her face went pale. The fact that I knew about their financial ruin terrified her even more than my rejection. "We are family, Joshua," she hissed, abandoning the gift basket on the hallway floor. "You don't turn your back on family." "You did," I said, 34 days ago. "Have a safe drive home, Mom." I closed the door gently until I heard the latch click. I didn't look through the peephole, but I heard the sharp clack of her heels rushing away down the hall. I knew this wasn't the end. Patricia Townsend didn't take no for an answer when bankruptcy was staring her in the face. The very next morning, Elijah called me with an update. His firm handled the ticketing for the annual Henderson Foundation Charity Gala in Washington, D.C., a highly exclusive black tie event where Chloe was scheduled to receive the prestigious Business Leadership Award. "Joshua," Elijah said, his tone serious, "your mother just purchased a table at the gala. It cost $5,000. She put it on a high-interest credit card." I had to laugh. The irony was so heavy it felt tangible. She wouldn't spend a Saturday afternoon attending my wedding for free, but she was willing to plunge herself further into debt, paying $5,000 for a seat in the same room as the daughter-in-law she had never bothered to get to know. They were desperate, and they were walking right into a trap they built themselves. The Henderson Foundation Charity Gala was held at the National Building Museum, a colossal, breathtaking space in the heart of D.C. with massive Corinthian columns and a vaulted ceiling. There were 400 guests in attendance. Senators, tech CEOs, hedge fund managers, and old money families. Chloe and I arrived in a Blacktown car. She wore a stunning, understated emerald green gown. I wore a tailored tuxedo. As we walked through the grand entrance, photographers snapped pictures. People stopped to shake Chloe's hand, congratulating her on the award. They looked at me with respect, introducing themselves, asking about my graphic design business. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the guy sitting by the swinging kitchen door. I was standing in the center of the room. I scanned the massive hall. It didn't take long to find them. Way in the back, near the service elevators, was table 14. They looked like refugees on a life raft. My mother was wearing a red dress that was entirely too loud for the occasion. My father, Richard, looked miserable in a suit that was 10 years out of style. Carter was nervously checking his phone, while Evelyn sat rigidly next to him, her eyes darting around the room, hunting for a target. They hadn't seen us yet. They were looking for the CEO from the Forbes article. They didn't realize she was already holding my hand. Dinner was served. The chamber orchestra played. I watched table 14 from across the room. I saw Evelyn point eagerly when the foundation director walked up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director announced, her voice echoing through the museum. "Tonight, we honor a leader whose vision in private equity is matched only by her commitment to philanthropy. Please welcome the CEO of Ashford Capital, Chloe Ashford." The spotlight hit our table. 400 people stood up and began to applaud. I watched table 14 as Chloe stood up. I watched my mother's champagne glass freeze halfway to her mouth. I watched Carter's jaw physically drop. Evelyn gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. They watched, paralyzed in shock, as the billionaire they desperately needed to save their lives leaned down, kissed the son they had thrown away, and walked gracefully up to the stage. Chloe took the microphone. She was brilliant. She spoke about the responsibility of wealth, about funding education programs, and about the hard work required to build something lasting. The room was captivated. Then she paused. She looked directly at me. "But none of this," she said, her voice softening, echoing clearly across the silent hall. "None of this matters without the right partner. I want to thank the man who loved me when he thought I was just a woman in a worn-out flannel shirt. The man who values character over a bank account. My husband, Joshua. You are my anchor." The applause erupted again. I stood up and nodded. I looked at table 14. My mother looked like she was going to be physically sick. My father was staring down at his plate. The game was over. The truth was out in the brightest light possible. But the night wasn't finished. As soon as the speeches concluded and the band started playing, I saw them moving. Patricia, Carter, and Evelyn were weaving aggressively through the crowd of wealthy donors, making a beeline straight for our table. My father trailed behind them, looking like a man walking to his own execution. I stood up. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out 3 folded pieces of paper, the printed files from my receipts folder. They reached our table just as Chloe stepped back down from the stage. "Chloe! Joshua!" Patricia cried out, throwing her arms open wide, projecting her voice so the surrounding tables could hear. "Oh, what a beautiful speech! We are just so incredibly proud of you both." She went in for a hug. I held up my hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. The people at the neighboring tables, including Helen Calder, the powerful board member who was currently my father's biggest remaining client, turned to watch the commotion. "Don't do that, Mom," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough to be heard over the jazz music. Evelyn stepped forward, pushing her pregnant belly out slightly, her face a mask of fake professional courtesy. "Chloe, it is such an honor to finally meet you properly. Carter and I have a real estate project in Virginia Beach that aligns perfectly with Ashford Capital's portfolio. We would love to set up a meeting next week to—" "Evelyn," I cut her off. I unfolded the first piece of paper. "This is a text message you sent to my brother 3 months ago." Evelyn stopped talking. She stared at the paper in my hand. I read it aloud, clearly and distinctly. Evelyn's exact words were, "Joshua's wife is just a day trader paper pusher. Keep them away from our real estate investors at the party. They look cheap." Evelyn's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. She opened her mouth, stammering, looking around at the wealthy guests who were now openly staring at her with disgust. "And this?" I said, unfolding the second piece of paper and turning directly to my mother. "I didn't ruin anything, Carter," I said, stepping closer to my brother. "You ruined it. All of you." I looked at all 4 of them. I felt 31 years of being pushed aside, 31 years of sitting by the kitchen door, completely evaporate from my chest. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. "You didn't come to my wedding because it wasn't worth your time," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden quiet pocket of the room. "You are only here tonight because my wife is worth your money." We will never do business with you, and we are no longer family. Do not ever approach us again." I folded the papers, put them back in my pocket, offered my arm to Chloe, and we turned our backs on them. We walked away, leaving the Townsend family standing in the middle of a room full of billionaires, completely and utterly exposed for exactly who they were. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. As Chloe and I walked toward the exit, someone called my name. I turned around. It was my father. Richard had separated himself from the frozen group of my mother, brother, and sister-in-law. He walked up to me, his shoulders slumped, his eyes looking older than I had ever seen them. He didn't look angry. He looked defeated. "Joshua," he said quietly, his voice trembling just a bit. "I'm sorry. I should have come to the wedding. I should have stood up to your mother." I looked at the man who had let me be treated like a second-class citizen in my own home for 3 decades. He was a coward. He chose a quiet life over protecting his own son. "I know, Dad," I said, "but sorry 34 days late at a billionaire's gala when your bank accounts are empty isn't sorry. It's strategy." He closed his eyes, accepting the blow because he knew it was true. He nodded slowly, turned around, and walked back to table 14 alone. The social fallout at the gala was instantaneous and brutal. My mother and Evelyn had tried to play the room, tried to network with the elite, but the elite had heard everything. Word spread through the National Building Museum like a wildfire. Nobody wants to do business with people who are cruel to their own blood. Helen Calder, my father's most important client, walked directly past Patricia without even acknowledging her existence. The next morning, Helen's lawyer would officially terminate her consulting contract with my father's firm, stating simply that she required associates with strong moral character. The salary my father relied on vanished overnight. As for Carter and Evelyn, they were radioactive. The hedge fund managers and private equity directors they tried to corner at the bar physically turned their backs on them. The truth I had dropped on them didn't just hurt their feelings. It completely destroyed their professional credibility. Chloe and I got into our town car. The doors closed, shutting out the noise of the gala and the flashing cameras. I leaned back against the leather seat and let out a long, heavy exhale. Chloe reached over and took my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I looked out the window at the glowing monuments passing by in the DC night. For the first time in my entire life, the heavy weight that had sat on my chest since I was 14 years old was completely gone. "Yeah," I smiled. "I'm finally okay." The next morning I woke up early. I didn't check my phone. I didn't care if there were more voicemails or apologies. The storm had passed, and it was time to clean up the debris. I went to my desk, pulled out a stack of crisp, white stationery, and wrote 5 letters. One for Patricia, one for Richard, one for Carter, one for Evelyn, and one for Aunt Linda. The letters were identical. They weren't emotional. They weren't angry. They were legally precise and absolutely final. I stated clearly that due to their consistent behavior and their attempt to exploit my wife's business for financial gain, I was permanently severing all ties. I explicitly stated that they were not to contact me, Chloe, or Ashford Capital by phone, email, mail, or through third parties. Elijah reviewed the letters for me. He nodded, impressed. "It's clean. It leaves no room for interpretation." I drove to the post office and sent all 5 letters via certified mail, requiring a signature upon delivery. I wanted a physical record that they had received my final boundary. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch with Chloe. I opened my phone settings, went to my contact list, and systematically blocked every single member of the Townsend family. I blocked their numbers. I blocked their social media accounts. I blocked their email addresses. Then, I called my service provider and completely changed my phone number. It was a physical act of erasing them from my daily life. It wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about protecting my peace. I realized that keeping the door cracked open for toxic people, hoping they will suddenly change and treat you with respect, is a waste of a life. The only way to win the game with people like my mother and my brother was to simply stop playing. I closed my laptop. The receipts folder was still there, but I knew I would never need to open it again. The war was over, and as the silence settled over my life, the real consequences for my family were just beginning to unfold. 6 months passed. The silence from my former family was absolute, mostly because they were entirely consumed by the fires burning down their own lives. You can't outrun bad math, and you certainly can't outrun bad karma. Evelyn and Carter's real estate project collapsed entirely. Without the bailout from Ashford Capital, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Keller residences. But the bank didn't just take the unfinished waterfront property. They came for the collateral. I heard the details through Elijah, who kept his ear to the ground in the DC legal circuits. Evelyn and Carter were forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The bank seized their multimillion-dollar house in Virginia Beach. That pristine white Porsche Cayenne Evelyn loved to brag about, repossessed right out of their driveway by a tow truck in the middle of the afternoon. They lost absolutely everything. My parents didn't fare much better. After losing the massive Helen Calder contract, my father's consulting firm essentially flatlined. He had to lay off his remaining staff and move out of his expensive office space. The salary he used to fund my mother's extravagant lifestyle disappeared. Without my father's money to float her failing business, Patricia's empire crumbled. She couldn't afford the massive rent hikes. Within 4 months of the gala, she was forced to permanently close 3 of her Maison Patricia locations. The remaining 2 were bleeding money. The woman who used to sneer at people who bought off-the-rack clothing was now desperately selling her own used designer purses and Chanel jackets on Poshmark just to make the mortgage payments on the house in Falls Church. The illusion of the perfect, wealthy Townsend family was dead. They were broke, humiliated, and exiled from the country club social circles they had sacrificed everything to climb. But the financial ruin wasn't even the worst part. The deepest cut came from inside their own house. It happened at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. My new phone rang. Only a handful of people had the number. It was Elijah. "Joshua?" Elijah said, his voice thick with sleep but laced with urgency. "Carter got your new number from a mutual college friend. He's begging me to put him through to you. It's an emergency." I sat up in bed. Chloe stirred next to me. I hesitated for a moment, then told Elijah to patch the call through. "Joshua." Carter's voice came through the speaker. He was crying. Not a performative, manipulative cry. He sounded completely broken, gasping for air. "Joshua, please don't hang up. Please." "I'm listening, Carter," I said quietly. The story spilled out of him in a rushed, panicked mess. During the intense forensic audit for their bankruptcy filing, Carter's lawyer had uncovered a massive, gaping hole in their personal finances. The missing operating expenses that Ashford Capital had flagged during their initial due diligence? It wasn't just bad accounting. Evelyn had been embezzling money from their own company, $340,000. But she didn't just steal the money to buy clothes or cars. The lawyer tracked the wire transfers to a private bank account. Evelyn had been funding a lavish apartment in downtown Norfolk for a man she had been having an affair with for over a year. She had drained the company dry, siphoned off the money they had set aside for a college fund for their new baby, and handed it to her lover right under Carter's nose. "She lied to me," Carter sobbed into the phone. "About everything. The business, the money. She served me with divorce papers an hour ago. She's trying to take full custody. Joshua, I have nothing. I don't know what to do." I sat in the dark bedroom, listening to the golden child cry. This was the brother who had mocked my life. This was the brother who watched our mother throw away my art and treat me like garbage, and he had simply smiled and taken the bigger piece of the pie. He had married a monster because she looked good on paper, and now the monster was eating him alive. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt a profound, heavy sadness for the pointless waste of it all. "You need a good divorce lawyer, Carter," I said, my voice completely steady. "And you need to figure out how to rebuild. But you have to do it on your own. Joshua, please, can I just come stay with you for a few days? I just need my big brother." "No, Carter," I said softly. "You don't have a brother anymore. You made sure of that a long time ago. Goodbye." I hung up the phone. I blocked his number. I laid back down next to Chloe, closed my eyes, and went right back to sleep. While their world burned down to the studs, mine was finally taking off. At the Henderson Foundation Gala, while my family was busy imploding at table 14, the foundation director had asked about my graphic design business. The next week, she called me into her office. She had reviewed my portfolio online. She didn't care that I was married to Chloe Ashford. She cared that my work was exceptionally good. She offered me the contract to lead the complete visual rebranding of their national education initiative. It was a massive project, the kind of career-defining work I had dreamed about for years. I earned it on my own merit with my own talent. The income from the Henderson contract, combined with the steady growth of my business, gave me the financial freedom I had always worked for. 6 months later, Chloe and I bought a house. It wasn't a sprawling, pretentious mansion in Falls Church. It was a beautiful, historic farmhouse in the Virginia countryside, surrounded by old oak trees and acres of quiet, green space. On our first weekend in the new house, I went out to the detached garage where we had stored some boxes from my old apartment. I dug through the back corner until I found a heavy, flat package wrapped in a thick black trash bag. I brought it inside, laid it on the living room rug, and carefully peeled the plastic away. It was the oil painting of the Shenandoah Valley, the one I had painted when I was 14 years old, the one that won first place, the one my mother told me wasn't important enough to look at. I wiped the dust off the canvas. The colors were still vibrant. The mountains still looked exactly the way I remembered them. Chloe walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She stopped and looked at the painting. "Joshua," she breathed, setting the mugs down. "That is stunning. Where has that been?" "Hidden," I said. "For 17 years. I picked up a hammer and a nail. I walked over to the center wall of our new living room, right above the stone fireplace. I drove the nail into the wall, lifted the heavy canvas, and hung the painting up. I stepped back and looked at it. The 14-year-old boy who had waited in the dark garage for his mother to finally notice his worth was gone. In his place was a man who knew exactly what his work, his time, and his heart were worth. It's been 2 years since that night at the gala. I'm sitting on the back porch of our farmhouse right now. The sun is setting behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long golden shadows across the grass. Chloe is inside, working on a puzzle in the living room, right underneath my painting. The house is quiet. It's a good kind of quiet. I don't hear from the Townsend family anymore. I know from Elijah that Carter's divorce was a bloodbath, that Patricia eventually had to sell the house in Falls Church to cover her debts, and that Richard is working a mid-level management job just to keep them afloat. They are living the exact nightmare they spent their entire lives trying to avoid. They are perfectly, painfully ordinary. People often say that the opposite of love is hate. I don't think that's true anymore. Hate requires energy. Hate requires you to still care about the person on the other end of the emotion. I think the true opposite of love is conditional presence. It's the people who only show up when you're shiny, when you're successful, or when you have something they can extract from you. My family never loved me. They loved the idea of what a family was supposed to look like, as long as it didn't inconvenience them. The moment I demanded basic human decency, the moment I stopped accepting the seat by the swinging door, the illusion shattered. I used to spend hours agonizing over why I wasn't good enough for them. I used to think the 24 empty chairs at my wedding were a reflection of my own failure. But looking back now, I realize those empty chairs were the greatest gift they ever gave me. They showed me exactly who they were, which gave me the freedom to walk away and figure out exactly who I am. I am Joshua. I am an artist. I am a husband. and I am finally wonderfully visible. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long journey, but it's a journey I know I didn't walk alone. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt like the supporting character in your own family's drama. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to draw a hard line with the people who were supposed to love you the most? I read the comments, and I would genuinely love to hear your experiences. And for those of you who made it all the way to the very end, welcome to the 1% Club. If you are hearing this right now, I want you to go down to the comments and drop the letter W for winner. That is our secret code. That tells me that you are part of the amazing group of people who stuck with me through the pain, the betrayal, and the victory at the end. You guys are the real winners here. Please don't forget to hit that like button and follow the page so we can keep hanging out and sharing these stories together. Take care of yourselves, know your worth, and I'll see you in the next one.